Jumping in right now, Republican Congressman Tom Cole of Oklahoma. Congressman, I'm sure a lot of people around the table are going to be having questions about gun safety. I want to start, though, with a basic question that's something I didn't know about, and apparently some members on the Hill didn't know about, and that's these bump fire stock gadgets that you can buy online for $40 that turn a semi-automatic weapon into a weapon that acts at least like an automatic weapon. Were you familiar with bump fire stocks?
No, I wasn't.
And do you think that Congress should look into that to see if perhaps they should be outlawed?
I think there's no question we ought to look into that. Look, automatic weapons are illegal. When I heard saw the clips and heard the fire, I just assumed he had an automatic weapon. I did not know that there was technology capable that cheaply of transforming a automatic into an automatic weapon. So yeah, I don't think there's any question we ought to look at that.
Congressman, it's Willie Geist. We've tried over the last couple of days to be constructive and specific in analyzing what happened in Las Vegas and what Congress legislatively could do to prevent something like that. As you look at all the details we now know about it, that he bought many of these weapons legally across several different states, that he bought illegal bump stock to bump those up to automatic weapons, what could be done, and what are you looking at doing to prevent the next Las Vegas?
Well, I think the bump stock issue is something we ought to look at, although people that know weapons better than I do tell me that there's relatively simple things that you could do in terms of yourself that wouldn't have the same effect, but would certainly be horrific. So this is something we need to look at. In terms of the crime itself, from what I know, and the investigation's still underway, it's just mystifying. I mean, there weren't the signs here that you would normally see in terms of a disturbed personality, in terms of a past criminal record, some trouble history. There doesn't seem to have been personal circumstances that drove him over the edge, and it is an act of unspeakable evil, and but it's not one that I've heard any convincing explanation as to how it happened, or much in the way of what we could do to stop it. I mean, the response was terrific. If you can, you hate to use superlatives in such an awful situation, but the people on the ground handled themselves as well as they could. The first responders, the police, moved quickly. The guy was not actually in the facility effectively that he was shooting into. We're going to have to spend a lot of time looking at this.
Congressman, are you alarmed at all that he had 49 weapons that we know of now, that he was able to buy that volume of that semi-automatic weaponry?
I have friends that many weapons. That's not uncommon in my part of the country. I mean, I literally could tick off 10 names right now of people they're collectors, they're sportsmen. This is something they do. They're not a threat to anybody, quite the opposite. They're some of the most solid citizens in my state. So that doesn't surprise me.
So do you, Congressman, then think this is just the price of doing business, then, to protect the Second Amendment?
I'm not going to be that dismissive, but yeah, I am very fierce about protecting the Second Amendment. And again, I know most of the people that own these weapons, I mean like 99.99%, aren't a threat to anybody. So to me, again, look, I'm from a state and was in public office where we lost almost 3 times as many people with a guy using fertilizer and a truck. So you can turn almost anything into a weapon of mass destruction if the evil intent is there to do it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we can to minimize this. We must. But I can't give you an easy or quick answer.
So some of your colleagues on this show yesterday on the Democratic side of the aisle said this again is a wake-up call that a civilian doesn't need an AR-15 or a semi-automatic rifle. I assume you'd be against banning that kind of weapon?
I would. There's millions of them in circulation. When they're used appropriately, they're not dangerous. They're obviously
they
weapons,
have been dangerous for some, Congressman.
Well, again, so are trucks driving into crowds. But so again, I don't see that as the obvious answer, and I don't think it would change. We have 300 million guns in circulation legally now. You're going to go back and reclaim them all? I think there's not an easy legislative fix here, and I think people that suggest there is, are not very persuasive in that regard.
So what do you recommend, Congressman? Is there anything you can come up with? Because a lot of people will listen to you this morning and Here's another Republican throwing up his hands in the wake of another mass killing in this country and saying there's nothing we can do about it. What do you suggest in terms of preventing the next one?
Well, the number one thing would be, and Congress has actually done some things in the last 2 years on this, is mental health money, although this guy doesn't look like he would have been. Yeah, absolutely. I want to look at this bump stock issue that, again, I was totally unaware of until this particular crime. I think that's something that we could do. But I don't know that there's any one overarching, quick, easy solution to something like this. Gun violence in America is down. That doesn't excuse this. It's down almost 50% since the early 90s. So it's not, it's a question of culture and mental health as much as it is of weaponry.
All right, Congressman Tom Cole.
Thank you, Congressman.
We appreciate you
Thank you,
coming on
See you.
today. George Will, yesterday it was hard to get Republicans to come out and say the sort of things that Tom Cole just said there. It does seem that Americans want a fix. 9 out of 10 Americans want increased background checks. 6 out of 10 Americans want to ban assault-style weapons. And yet, you look at every one of these incidents and you wonder what impact would it have had. And by the way, I'm one of those Americans. I believe what the court said in Heller at the same time. I think this has gotten far too extreme.
Well, Americans want a fix. I want lobsters to grow on trees. The world doesn't conform to our desires. There is a human reflex. It's not natural, it's cultural, it's learned, to say now, in the modern age, if something's wrong in society, government can fix it, if we're just clever enough.
Right.
And you can't. There are 325 million people in this country. A small portion of them are stark raving mad, or are going to be tomorrow. This guy one day was quite normal to everybody who knew him, and then he suddenly wasn't. And there are just limits. It's part of the tragedy of human existence. There are limits to what you can do about it.
So I disagree. But wait a second. Michael sat down and said we watched a baseball game last night, and we need to deal with the strike zone, and so we can deal with the time of the game. I don't disagree with you, but people react and say they want government to do everything. But this happens so often. There's got to be something more we can do. This is not a once every 10-year phenomenon. This is happening monthly, almost, it seems. I remember when I was in Congress and Columbine happened, it seemed like it had never happened before. And now, the number of times that these incidences have happened, look, I understand what you're saying, but I think on this issue, there's something more. And I agree with Tom Cole about the bump stock thing, but he was a little flippant about anything can be turned into a weapon. Of course, I could take this pen here, but when I use this pen correctly, it writes. When you use a gun correctly, it fires a bullet.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something more, something more we can do.
But there's an element, George alluded to, part of it is cultural, and part of it is rooted in fear. And where that fear comes from, nobody knows. I mean, Tom Cole just told us he knows, and he could name at least 10 people off the top of his head who own at least 49 weapons. Why would you own 49 weapons?
Look, you can't go into a drugstore and buy razors without them opening the thing for you to be able to buy the razor. You can't buy nasal medicine in a store without showing ID and demonstrating that you're not a bad
I'm with
person.
you.
I'm with your point. Something can be, I'm not saying people can own 100 guns if they want, but something, we got to be able to understand what's at work here, and whether it's cultural or whatever. There are 59 people dead, 500 injured this morning. We've got to be able to do something more than
George's point is well taken, though. There are almost as many guns in this country as there are people. So you could ban guns today, and somebody who wants to go kill people will get their hands on a gun.
Pat Moynihan once said we've got a 200-year supply of guns in this country. We have 2 years supply of ammunition. You want to ban something?
But there's gun
regulate
buyback programs. There's different ways of trying to get them, I mean,